ninepence.
I'm not dead.
What?
Nothing. Here's your ninepence. I'm not dead.
Yeah. He says he's not dead.
Well, surprise, surprise, my free trial of life hasn't ended. Although, given the absolute state of much of the world right now, you wouldn't be off base in assuming that I had, in fact, left this mortal coil. But no, friends, I live. A little worse for the wear, yeah, but I'm alive nonetheless.
I am alive! He's nice. Yes, this is stupid.
What have I been up to then, you ask? Why, I was just taking a nice, long, relaxing vacation inside of a hospital in the UK during the height of a certain global,
Uh-oh. Stinky.
you know, thing that I can't name because it's the YouTube equivalent of saying Voldemort right now.
Blasphemy! He said it again!
And while YouTube may not want you to see videos about the Coof that must not be named, as we'll learn over the course of this video, demystifying a disease is important for public health. Thus, in this video, we're going to discuss the psychology and the communication idiosyncrasies surrounding outbreaks, from how we talk about them, or maybe not about them, to how they spread, not so much physically, but mentally across the populace. The role of fear and stigma in association with those responses, be they official or governmental or personal, and just how we tend to react to fears or our own mortality, often paradoxically. While I was in the hospital for stuff unrelated to the thing I cannot name, I was just a few wards away from said big bad monetization murdering malaise, so I got somewhat of my own first-hand experience. But considering how this topic has dominated the news cycle and discourse for months now, you'd have to be socially distancing under a pretty big rock to have avoided the strange psychology of fear and stigma associated with the dreaded C word. And I'm sorry for self-censoring, but I myself was in the hospital for a little over a month, and it just has become a bit of habit at this point, a bit of a communication mindworm, to avoid saying what the C word actually is. Now in this video, I could just update you with some disturbing facts, like the fact that the Coof seems to be particularly dangerous for men lower in testosterone, and women high in the same hormone, as found by Schroeder et al. 2020. Or that it may have effects on the female reproductive cycle, beyond just possible transmission between mother and child, as seen in data from Jing et al. 2020. But if the dates of those studies don't give it all away, yeah, there's still a lot of new research being done on this novel virus. Well, if we look to research on how people respond to similar scenarios, there's plenty there for us to play with in terms of data. So today, let's not look at the disturbing numbers associated with that thing that I can't name, or even its effects on the economy or politics or what have you, but rather just how this whole debacle affects you, me, and everyone we know. Not physically, but mentally. And not only because it's of some really significant importance to everyone's lives right now, but because, oh yeah, there's research on that. But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is a fast and super easy to use virtual private network that you can use as a desktop app or even as a simple Chrome extension, so access to a freer internet is just at the tip of your fingers. If you're concerned about the current global health issues, you're probably tired of seeing ads for masks, disinfectant, or even just TP, but with Surfshark, you can say goodbye to creepy targeted advertising and buy your TP in privacy, as it should be. Feeling bored in quarantine? Well, not anymore, as Surfshark lets you easily change locations to watch your favorite shows that would normally be region blocked in your country on sites like Netflix. While I can relive the time when Doctor Who was good from the UK, if you're in the US, just change your location and Allons-y, all the new Who you could actually watch, all for less than $2 a month when you use the code AIDEN and save 84% on your subscription to Surfshark, linked in the description below. You have nothing to lose but a lot of safe, secure, and never before available browsing to gain to keep yourself entertained in these trying times by trying out Surfshark VPN using the code AIDEN. So, now that you've got a backlog of quarantine viewing to watch, let's talk about that quarantine and how media messages about our health may not always work as planned. Health messages intended to educate the public with accurate information about a disease or other similar concern for community well-being may evoke, often, behaviors which do little to improve the circumstances regarding that disease and dissemination of information regarding the disease. How we talk about something contagious may vary widely based on any number of variables that involve the disease, its spread or its cure, and the target susceptible populations. To illustrate this, Gutman, no, not that one.
It's Gutsman!
And Salmon 2004 recalled the development of healthcare pamphlets for Ethiopian migrants in Israel, the ones they didn't eat and send back by the way, in which a focus group of men and women workshopped ideas to inform fellow Ethiopian immigrants with diabetes about proper foot care using a comic strip. Several of the female participants in this study objected to the image because it depicted a woman washing the feet of an elderly man, which despite being culturally normative among that population was objected to as some felt it was sexist. Women, am I right? The point is that health messages can be tricky, and they may often lead to the exact opposite of their intended effect, particularly when the threat to health is a stigmatized one.
Is it diabetes? No, you're pregnant.
Witt 1992 summarized how fear appeals affect how we perceive and respond to messages in ways that may cause more harm than good in the grand scheme of things, specifically through individual aspects of fear, threat, and efficacy. So, first, we gotta define some terms, because I'm gonna use them a lot, even if they seem self-evident. Fear is a negatively valenced state of emotional arousal, usually elicited by a threat. Not all threats are equally threatening, however, as the individual must also believe that the threat is more serious than a simple case of the sniffles, or that he or she is more susceptible to it than the rest of the population. In addition to threat, when faced with a fear-laden message, we also take efficacy into consideration. In other words, what options are available to curb the Coof through mitigating actions in response to any given health scenario, such as wearing a protective mask, and in one's own beliefs that said Coof can be curbed based on individual action. With efficacy and susceptibility in mind, when one is exposed to a fear appeal regarding health, the message may be accepted, avoided, or produce psychological reactants, with reactants essentially being the know you phenomenon, wherein a message designed to warn against and decrease the frequency of a harmful activity instead results in a boomerang effect, wherein an individual becomes emboldened in his or her engagement in the susceptible or dangerous behavior targeted by the health message as harmful. That is, while some will accept a health message as accurate and alter their actions accordingly, for example, quitting smoking or avoiding public places in the case of the Coof, others will view health messages as a challenge to their self-efficacy and their ego, and produce psychological reactants. And yes, reactants really just is a technical term for you can't tell me what to do, you're not my real dad.
You can't tell me what to do!
Fear then often produces maladaptive responses to health-related threats indirectly, based on individual efficacy. When efficacy is low, people are more likely to experience reactants and maintain unhealthy behaviors when exposed to fear, mediated by threat. That is, if it's scary and it's something that could realistically happen, and there's no good way to prevent it, people are more prone to ignore health messages and maintain their behaviors via reactants. In contrast, when efficacy is high, fear may instead forward adaptive responses, again mediated by threat, meaning that if it's scary, realistically probable, and something that can be ameliorated with effort, then behavioral change is more likely to occur than if the threat is lacking in efficacy beyond just flashing a dang logo. In short, perceived threat determines the degree or intensity of the reaction to the message, while perceived efficacy determines the nature of the reaction, either ignoring the threat or even engaging in maladaptive behaviors out of fear, or adopting defensive behaviors to mitigate danger. Let's put this all together so it makes more sense. First, there's a perceived threat to health, and since we're using examples unrelated to the current event to stay off of Susan's naughty list, or at least attempt to, let's say that health concern is fishwagon. Fishwagon is a disorder that causes one to grow tentacles and smell of the sea, and occurs after sitting on an uncovered wagon seat. It's something my friends and I came up with in high school via, I believe, a phrase generator, so don't think too hard about it. We didn't. So, using fishwagon as our example, we have a behavior, the joys of sitting on a wagon seat. Presumably yelling yeehaw as one does, which is the obvious reward that sitting on a wagon seat entails. But there comes also a risk, as mentioned, catching a mean case of the fishwagon, growing tentacles, and adopting a fishy odor. The greater the reward, say I also paid you to sit on the wagon, the more likely one is to engage in the dangerous behavior, when the reward outweighs the risk. In contrast, people are more likely to avoid dangerous situations when the costs are maximal, and a great deal of potential harm is incurred by that risk.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
That all still sounded pretty abstract though, right? So let's look at some less fishy, more concrete, as in hard pavement examples. By which I mean, I'm gonna show you some Thai life insurance ads.
ผมอยากมีเวลามากกว่านี้ เวลาที่จะบอกลูกผมว่า ผมรักเขามากที่สุดในโลก ลุกขึ้นมา ลุกอย่างนี้เดียว เราลูกผู้ชายล่ะ อยากใช้เวลาเข้าใจเขามากกว่านี้โกหกชัดๆฉันเห็นแกไปมั่วสุมพวกดนตรีอะนั่นแหละบ้านเพื่อน อยากฟังในสิ่งที่เขาอยากพูด แน่แล้วใช่ไหม ออกไป อยากคุย อยากฟังเพลงของเขา อยากขอโทษ ก็อย่างที่ผมบอก ผมอยากมีเวลามากกว่านี้ เวลาที่จะได้ทำในสิ่งที่ผมยังไม่ได้ทำ เวลาที่จะรัก และดูแลเขามากกว่านี้
Sure, those sniffles and red eyes are just allergies, but now compare that one to another ad from Ireland.
Pack your bags, we're leaving today. What is taking you so long? Don't look back, we're on our way. Turn up our favorite song. We're going wherever the wind blows, and enjoy the ride along the way. Forget the past, we'll be okay. Let's both sing out loud with all.
Top of the morning to you, ladies!
Sorry, I couldn't help but turn that one into a bit of a meme, but it's just so darn easy, exactly because the fear-eliciting threat in this example is so over the top as to be comedic, and for that reason, it will probably fail to produce adaptive behaviors, and instead, potentially produces reactance in response. In both ads, the accident is, well, an accident, but the scenarios and the outcomes differ highly. In the Thai ad, we see a father drifting into oncoming traffic while on the way to see his estranged son in concert, lost momentarily in thoughts about their relationship. In the Irish ad, not only do we see no indication of distraction denoting efficacy, but we also see that, rather than hitting a truck head-on, and as the words imply running out of time, that in this case, it's a class of children in danger rather than another driver. This ad became somewhat infamous, not only because it depicts an initial DS car flip, but also because of said flip's graphic nature that made the ad come off like black humor more than a serious health message. It ends up producing the opposite of the intended fear effect, and it's hard to be afraid when the sheer levels of deja vu have you laughing at its creator's attempt to promote safe driving and instead, as the Independent described it, intended to improve social conduct through the use of nightmares. Because, oh boy, does this commercial seem like a fever dream, and as such it's hard to imagine how this would convince anyone, or at least based on the EPPM we talked about earlier, to not just drive into stone walls.
Behold, our newest ad campaign.
Are you sure this will help us sell more burgers?
Burgers?
These two ads have an almost identical plot and setup, yet are vastly different in execution. Pardon the pun, but they're illustrative of how tone-deaf health campaigns fall flat on a field of helpless children. So, how can health campaigns do more harm than good? It's not uncommon for health messages or campaigns to result in a kind of iatrogenesis. That's just a big word way of describing when an attempt to heal a problem ends up producing more harm than good. For example, Skinner et al. 1998 found that older and minority women who attended a breast cancer education session continued to believe that sexual activity caused breast cancer, even though, it doesn't. Much as with the reckless driving adverts, it's often the case that believing disease or misfortune is in some way the fault of an affected person diminishes thoughts of personal susceptibility. After all, I didn't do anything wrong, so how could I be susceptible? It's not all bad though, as participants fared better on other questions, with nearly 3 times as many women correctly answering questions about breast cancer and age, and twice as likely to believe treatment works best in younger women after attending an information seminar. Similarly, Shen and Cole's 2015 examined how different anti-smoking ads were received by American university students aged 18 to 32, who were mostly 72% non-smokers. Across 4 conditions, participants were exposed to fear-inducing pamphlets that encouraged self-efficacy or response efficacy in quitting smoking, or unrelated jokes in various orders, and then after all of this were asked about their intentions to smoke. The researchers found that within subjects, meaning those who were exposed to fear and humor, or the efficacious messages, in those participants, psychological reactance was low or completely avoided. In between individuals testing, this was not the case, as those who only saw the fear appeals, or those who only saw the humorous ads, were pretty high in reactance. This means that while reactance can cause fear appeals to potentially lead to unhealthy behaviors, efficacy and humor can mitigate the effects of reactance, and result in more cautious, rational behavior. In summation, fear appeals can be effective at persuasion when they're followed up with efficacy-inducing options or even just humor. Trying to scare someone to change their health behavior probably won't effectively produce that behavioral change you're looking for, and instead often produces a boomerang effect. An example of the boomerang effect and fear in relation to health information to shed some further light on this phenomenon is present in April, Shizipika, and Emery 2017, who examined responses to an anti-smoking campaign called TIPS on Twitter. The TIPS program was developed by the US federal government to facilitate reducing smoking in the population by encouraging quitting and preventing new smokers from picking up the habit. The 2012 campaign was massive, spreading multimedia landscapes, and it certainly worked in terms of outreach, with the CDC reporting a 132% increase to calls on their national tip line and an over 400% increase in website views related to budding out cigarettes. To assess reactions to the campaign on Twitter, gathering 1,165 tweets related to the TIPS project, found overwhelmingly that the most common response was levity and humor, comprising 86.3% of tweets, which included gems that stand the testament of human intellect, such as LMMFAO, Det Cigarette Commercial, KML, SH.T, Funny AF. Yeah, pure comedy genius. Additional categories carried similar words of wisdom, such as denial, quote, "What's the has to happen so you wind up like the lady in the smoking commercial with a hole in her neck. Just smoking can't do that. Defensive avoidance. Quote, I wish they stopped showing this smoker commercial with this old white lady sounding like Daffy Duck. And reactance, our old friend. Quote, every time I see an anti-smoking commercial, I light one up, hashtag it. The point is, people don't often take attempts to persuade them very seriously when the subject matter is grim. In fact, precisely when the onus concerns life and death, because thinking about such topics is psychologically taxing, for one, and secondly, because we generally don't like being told what to do. Or, more apt for the current global, being told what we can't do. Shut up, WHO, you can't tell me what to do, you're not my real dad. Similar boomerang effects have been reported in regards to social rather than commercial advertisements involving distracted driving, as illustrated by Lennon, Renfro, and O'Leary 2010. Distracted driving is about what it sounds like, and I'm sure most of you have come across some variant of the asshole blasting the radio, talking over speakerphone and simultaneously texting while driving and drinking a smoothie, or some variant thereof. You know, that guy. Participants rated the level of distraction experienced by that guy before and after watching a PSA about the dangers of said distractions. The researchers polled 673 young drivers and found women were more likely than men to report engaging in all forms of distracted driving, except playing music, which was similar in frequencies across both of the sexes. After watching a PSA about distracted driving, while participants viewed all distractions as more, well, distracting than they did before watching the PSA, said PSA had the opposite effect on their own reports of future action. That is, participants indicated greater intentions to drive while talking, texting, eating, and playing music after they watched a PSA warning against those very behaviors. There's the Boomerang Effect. This effect was present across the sexes, with both men and women somewhat paradoxically reporting higher intentions to engage in distracted driving after they watched these PSAs. Women were particularly prone to this trend, and in summation, being told that texting while driving was bad only ends up emboldening one to embrace the mantra of Latrarian Milton by driving while drunk and smoking with cigarettes. For, in his immortal words,
I want to do it because it's fun. It's fun to do bad things.
Once again here, we can see that attempts to change behavior with fear often produce the antithesis of the intended effect. When, as with the anti-smoking campaign, our minds are drawn to thoughts of our own mortality, we may also be drawn not just to reactants in opposition to what we're being warned of, but may also adopt ideas that we would normally not hold, as illustrated by Arrowwood et al., 2017. In a preliminary study, participants were asked to think about what it would be like to get Ebola.
Everybody with Ebola. Let's Kung Fu!
Then they completed a series of puzzles wherein they filled in the blanks in words to measure implicit death thought. No, not like that. For example, participants thinking about death may complete a word that begins with the letters C-O-F-F as coffin rather than coffee, while thinking about the cough, or coof, in this case Ebola. The researchers indicated that those asked to think about Ebola also thought more about their own personal demise. Additionally, those thinking about Ebola expressed greater religious fundamentalism as a state, that is, their current feelings and beliefs in a higher power. To explicate how fundamentalism was measured, items included things like, quote, God has given humanity a complete, unfailing guide to happiness and salvation, which must be totally followed. That is, people who were prompted to think about their own mortality by exposure to information about a dangerous disease, like the Coof, which dominated the news cycle, the more likely they were to agree with fundamentalist ideas, which may carry its own dangers.
Son, have you been reading heresy recently? Unacceptable!
We've seen that fear appeals can work, but they also run the risk of causing more damage than good when they either scare too deeply, or when alternative options are too difficult or even possible to perform in response. We've looked at individuals, but do communities react to the spread of something like the Coof with reactants as well? To get a better idea of how people respond to public health issues when asked about them in public, Thompson et al. 2015 held town hall meetings in Canada concerning the Indonesian H1N1 outbreak in the late 2010s, and found two competing concerns amongst their sample, economic and ethical. And an eerily familiar bunch of responses were noted. Participants reacted with indignation when a foreign country, in this case Indonesia, was described as refusing to cull animal herds or share samples of the disease unless they received financial aid. Economic concerns included a demand for quid pro quo, that is, people are only willing to make changes to their behavior when they feel others, including other governments or organizations, are similarly willing to change their behaviors as well. Another related concern was one of self-interest, with several participants emphasizing local problems over global ones. Other economic issues were more clearly financial, as many Canadian participants were unwilling to provide aid without any form of a payback, and similarly many demanded incentives to be provided to Canada in exchange for aid, specifically samples of the H1N1 virus for study, and perhaps an Indonesian ladyboy or two, although the latter one there is of course off the record. In terms of ethical concerns, excluding my speculation about the ladyboys, participants unsurprisingly prioritized the safety of Canadians and Canada over Indonesia, and expressed little empathy for the Indonesian people, while others felt Canada had enough issues of its own to bother with a country half a world away.
How the fuck can a peanut kill someone? It's not even a person.
One participant expressed this concern by questioning why Canadians were expected to solve Indonesia's problems when we can't even solve our problems at home yet. Others were preoccupied with reciprocity, wondering why their country should aid another that likely would not be able to provide aid where the tables turned. Still others were unwilling to help without Indonesian transparency and honesty regarding H1N1. And finally, others desired nothing more than a feeling of solidarity or global connectedness. Any of these reactions sound a little bit similar to the stuff that we've seen more recently? Just some behaviors and opinions to keep in mind, for despite how much we may have advanced technologically since the 2010s, our psychology is much slower to adapt. What else then, beyond reactants, affects our willingness to accept media messages about health issues then? Beyond just reactants, there are several other reasons that we may be hesitant to listen to the warnings of health-related messages, including the stigma related to having a certain disease or disorder. Not all health concerns are perceived equally by society, now are they? That's just an unfortunate reality, and it's often based on some good reasoning. While some might struggle with his or her weight due to a legitimate thyroid problem, more commonly, obesity is the result of lifestyle rather than factors completely outside of one's control. And with a degree of control comes varying degrees of stigma. More control, more stigma; less control, less stigma.
The only thing more noble than eating chicken out of a bucket is filling up your fountain drink.
While arguably most, if not all, health concerns carry some stigma, be it due to age or location, diseases which are the result of one's choices, the choices of an individual action or behavior, such as diabetes, usually carry the more negative weight, and pun intended, in terms of public perceptions, even though not all types of diabetes are associated with weight problems. Similarly to diabetes, lung cancer too carries significant stigma of associating the disease with smoking when many suffer without having so much as ever touched a cigarette, and yet if one hears the term lung cancer, the mind pretty much immediately goes for a dart. As a result, and illustrated by Chappelle, no, not that one.
Why do black people love menthol so much?
I don't know.
That is correct.
Zyland and McPherson 2004, in a sample of British participants with lung cancer, they found many reported a feeling of shame due to the associations with smoking regardless of whether or not they themselves had ever smoked. One participant, a 56-year-old carpenter, noted this stigma in his own experience with lung cancer, saying, "When I went to see an oncologist for further treatments because I'd had an operation and I'd had half of my left lung removed, I asked them what he thought had caused it, and he just laughed and said, 'That's obvious, through smoking.'" Despite never having smoked, the doctor insisted that he must have, hence associating the culpability of smoking with a man who had done nothing directly by his own choice to cause his condition. Others in the study were so ashamed that they reported hiding their illness or avoiding support, with the aforementioned patient refusing to even tell a judge about his condition and subsequently was denied tax relief, just because he was afraid of the stigma that came with lung cancer. In short, diseases that carry stigma may have other harmful effects on society, with people concerned they may have a disease, avoiding the treatment for that very disease, and hiding their symptoms out of fear of stigma. For many, lung cancer is the result of smoking, plain and simple, just as diabetes mellitus type 2 is often the result of lifestyle habits. Yet both disorders can occur due in no way to an individual's behavior. But in the majority of cases, the cause is horses, not zebras. For those who don't have a disease, stigma can have some potentially harmful effects, as found by Smith, 2012, who studied reactions to an invented disease called Cautela acervarivirus, or CAV for short, which was supposedly spread between humans and originated from rats, similar to the hantavirus. Participants were asked several questions after listening to or watching a public health warning about CAV. After exposure to the PSA, participants were more cynical, more likely to suggest that those with the disease be isolated or quarantined, and reported being likely to share the alert's message with others. These tendencies, however, did not coincide with irrational fears, anger, and perceived responsibility, distrust, or stigma to those with the disorder. This was largely based on how participants believed the exposure to CAV had occurred, via human-to-human exposure, which is difficult to avoid, or rat-to-human exposure, which was seen as higher in culpability, clearly understanding the importance of carrying a good, strong rat stick.
Maybe I could give it a quick whirl in the basement and see if I could kill a couple of rats.
Yeah, absolutely. You've earned it. Go bash them up, buddy.
In short, those who contracted the disease from hanging around with rats were seen as more responsible for their condition. However, participants were also less angry at those who caught CAV from rodents, and it makes some sense that people may feel pity for those on rat duty. Interestingly, the disease was seen as equally stigmatized in terms of its gross-out factor, regardless of how it presented, visible or invisible. Unsurprisingly, when CAV was described as curable, people with the disease were rated as less dangerous, and participants expressed lowered fear than when the disease was described as incurable. Perceived danger was highest in human-to-human transmission when the disease was particularly perilous, while perceived culpability was highest in rat-to-human transmissions when the disease was less serious. Additionally, the highly cynical viewed CAV as more dangerous in general, so being a negative Nancy or being highly afraid were both traits related to perceptions that infected people were dangerous, gross, and in need of quarantine. In summation, people often hold irrational beliefs about those with a contagious disease, not only viewing them as responsible for their lot, but also seeing them as grotesque, at least in some cases. Given that the current global health crisis originated in China, does the stigma of disease afflict Asian people more than other contagious diseases do? Fortunately or not, we have other relatively similar cases of an epidemic originating in China relatively recently to look at in comparison: SARS. Eichelberger 2007 interviewed locals in and around New York City's Chinatown, wherein there was significant economic damage for years after the outbreak, and which received international media coverage, much like the current Coof. Although unlike the Coof, with well over 100,000 confirmed cases in New York City, no cases of SARS were confirmed at the height of the panic surrounding it, at least not in NYC. One participant noted anti-Asian sentiments on public transport akin to, quote, driving while black, saying, quote, it was really noticeable on the train. If there was an Asian coughing on the train, people would look at them nasty and move away. Also, he did note this behavior made it hard to get a seat because others often avoided sitting near Asian riders. But hey, just a little pro tip for you there: if you happen to be Asian, just wear a mask and cough and prepare to Asian spread to your delight on public transit. The point is, though, that epidemics can cause intergroup distrust or even fear. As one participant noted, quote, I feel if I saw people who seemed like they just came from China, like recent immigrants, I would tend to keep an eye on them. I would look and think, do they have it? Do they not have it?
The situation is expected to deteriorate as newscasters whip the city into a panic. Run! Run for your lives!
So we've seen that stigma is associated with contagious diseases, but is this stigma decreased when one possesses greater amounts of information about said disease? Wrote It All, 2017, asked college student participants to imagine a scenario wherein they were working on a group project with another student, gender-neutrally named Sam. Sam was described as leaving the group to use the bathroom up to 5 times during a group meeting. Some participants were told Sam had previously disclosed suffering from irritable bowel syndrome, while others were told Sam had never disclosed having that disorder. Participants were then asked about their perceived rather than actual knowledge of irritable bowel syndrome, or IBD. People who believed Sam was open about having IBD subsequently reported less stigma toward those with the disease, regardless of its severity. Those already familiar with IBD or who had personal experiences with the condition were also generally less likely to hold stigmatic beliefs about Sam. In toto, the more people felt that they knew about IBD, the less stigma they associated with it. This is why having accurate information about disorders, even non-communicable ones, is important, as it helps reduce irrational stigma. With this in mind then, does hearing, reading, or watching news about a disease that is communicable then lead to decreased stigma when more is known about the disease? Well, not necessarily.
It'll make you blind and insane, but it won't kill you. The smallpox will.
Bergeron and Sanchez provided college students with a questionnaire that assessed their general knowledge and their anxiety surrounding exposure to SARS, a virus again not so unlike the one currently a public concern. Participants were asked about their access to various news outlets, including the internet, magazines, newspapers, radio, and television that covered the disease, as well as their perceptions of the frequency of coverage. In terms of actual knowledge of SARS, health majors tended to know more than did other majors, but an interesting effect occurred in regard to knowledge and media coverage. Anxiety levels, either high or low, were similar, but there were slightly more participants, 57%, who had minimal anxiety after exposure to information, while the majority of participants, 77%, felt there was too much media coverage of SARS. Yet nearly 69% of those who felt there was too much coverage failed a basic test of knowledge regarding the virus. That means that while most people were tired of hearing about a global health issue, more than 2/3 of college students polled failed a simple test of knowledge regarding the disease. Now, perhaps that was a direct result of the fact that only 29% of respondents were in a health-related major, but as we saw, while health majors did tend to know a little bit more than non-health majors on some issues, specifically the cause of SARS and if there was a cure, they were about as knowledgeable as non-health majors on the transmission and symptoms of the disease. So if there are these huge gaps in knowledge, produced in part by stigma, since we've seen that is the case with SARS, CAV, and IBD, are the same knowledge gaps present when it concerns the Coof? It's not unreasonable to compare the SARS panic to the current concern with the Coof, in any number of ways. After all, COVID-19 is literally SARS-2 epidemic boogaloo, and the public concern quite reasonably mirrors the fears expressed in the early 2000s regarding SARS. But by looking to the research of the past, we can also gain a better understanding of the ongoing crisis. And what Bergeron and Sanchez found is a lot of fear with very little knowledge. Almost 2 times the amount of people who passed a knowledge test of SARS failed that same test. That is, both people afraid or unafraid of a viral outbreak may often know very little about it, and we don't just have to look at similar related diseases, as we already have a lot of early data concerning the Coof. Geldsetzer 2020 gathered data from 80,000 US and UK participants who were asked various questions about the Coof to see just how much people actually knew about the novel virus. Really quickly, if you're wondering why I so rarely mention sample size, it's because you can get a pretty good representative sample using true random sampling methods with about 200 participants. But if you're looking at entire countries, well, the bigger the sample, the better. And 80K is pretty darn big for a social science study. But the researchers note that their sample was one of convenience, using first-come, first-served methods in an online survey. So while random sampling is ideal, to get big numbers like that, sometimes you take everything that you can get. There are detriments and advantages to almost all types of survey methods, but that's a topic for another video. I just wanted to make a quick aside to mention it because I know that you all are a bunch of smart cookies, and you take note of things like sample size. Anyway, with that in mind, let's look at those 80,000 pieces of data.
Numbers.
First of all, let me make something really clear, because this is the thing that Susan is apparently most butt-mad about concerning the Coof. The majority of people in this study did not overwhelmingly believe that the virus was man-made. But still, 24% of Americans and 18% of Brits believe to any degree that the Coof was engineered, indicating that, yes, most people think that the virus is naturally occurring. In terms of people potentially infected, US respondents believe that the number ranged between 20 and 500 people, while UK residents reported lower ranges of 13 to 200. Of course, these data were collected between the 23rd of February and the 3rd of March, so the numbers are probably vastly different from when they were collected to how they are now, as confirmed cases rose into the tens of thousands. Even at the time, though, the majority of Americans and Brits believed that more than 500 people would, well, oof, as a result of the Coof in the near future. People expected relatively low mortality rates between 3 and 5%, which again, that sounds small, but it would be massive even in these percentages of up to 500 people, and that the most affected would be adults. Although over half of American respondents believe that children would also be severely affected by the Coof. In terms of symptoms, misconceptions abound, with between 80 and 84% identifying symptoms that the disease does commonly present with, including cough, fever, and shortness of breath. But that means that up to 20% didn't believe that those were symptoms of the Coof, while interestingly, between 19 and 25% of participants identified symptoms not generally associated with the disease, such as nosebleeds, rash, and constipation, or frequent urination. Respondents also often had inaccurate ideas about how to handle themselves from a medical perspective, with an average of 36% of Americans and 21% of UK citizens reporting that if they had a symptom and recent contact with people from China or had recently visited the country themselves, that he or she would delay seeking care by 2 to 3 days, attend the emergency department unannounced, or take a taxi or public transport to their primary care provider. About 1/3 of people, 38% in the US and 30% in the UK, believe that wearing masks would protect against the virus, when that's not the case. A cloth mask can help prevent the spread from those who already have it, but it does not protect the uninfected. All of this is important to keep in mind concerning your own safety, dear friends. But what again about fear and stigma plays a role here? We can see with this novel virus the exact same stigma we've seen with other disorders. More than a quarter of respondents, 25% in the US and 29% in the UK, believe that avoiding Chinese food and restaurants would decrease your chances of being exposed to the Coof. Many also said that they would deny a ride share with a person who looked Asian, 30% in the US and 40% in the UK. Additionally, 29% of Americans and 24% of UK residents believe that a package from China could help spread the disease, and while the virus can live on some surfaces for over 2 weeks, the CDC has stated that the risk of contamination from packages is very low. In other words, people don't necessarily have accurate ideas about how even a widely covered disease is spread, and may take precautions like wearing masks, while simultaneously stigmatizing people or places that they feel are associated with said disease. With that said, there are some types of masks that do help prevent the spread of the virus, but these are not the typical cloth masks that you see being worn. So does having more information about the Coof change behavior? Have people become more hygienic, more health conscious in response to media coverage of the disease? Well, kind of. Oosterhoff 2020 asked adolescents about their attitudes towards the Coof and behaviors that they engaged in during the outbreak. 59% of young people engaged in social distancing by not hanging out with anyone who was not a member of their household. More than half use antibacterial soap at least once a day, and almost 63% used disinfectant wipes at least once in the last week. 74% watched coverage of the outbreak at least a little, and 18% admitted to hoarding supplies. The more severe people felt the disease was, the more likely they were to hoard. The more people watched the news, the more serious they considered the virus to be, which is not unique in this particular case, but rather an anticipated response in accordance with something called mean world syndrome, which is basically a belief that the world is a nastier place than it really is, and is usually incurred by exposure to media. Meanwhile, the more self-involved one is, the less likely they were to engage in social distancing, while people who felt socially responsible were more likely to distance themselves. Those who felt they had a social responsibility to not make things worse were also more likely to use disinfectant and monitor the news. In summation, while most people will try to be safer to some degree, and a few will even engage in hoarding, there will always be some people who are self-absorbed and refuse to follow health warnings. Again, this goes back to psychological reactance, in that people simply don't like being told what to do. So is there any way to encourage social distancing and other healthy behaviors that would not be met with reactance? Well, Fatheicher et al. 2020 examined people's willingness to socially distance in relationship to the empathy that they feel for others. As they anticipated, trait empathy was related to greater propensity to distance oneself in the face of the Coof, and this tendency carried over in samples of American and German participants. The effect was less prominent when participants were asked about visiting elderly relatives, as respondents generally expressed a desire to stay farther away from elderly people, likely believing them, or the facilities that home them, to be easily susceptible to the virus or vectors to the disease, and potentially not wanting to expose themselves. In both cases, greater social distancing was dependent on feelings of empathy, caring for others and not wanting to harm them rather than simply to protect the self. In an additional experiment, participants were either given information about the importance of social distancing or given the same information and then watched a short clip about an elderly man only able to occasionally visit his wife in the hospital for short amounts of time.
Kann man als Angehörige nicht mehr seine Frau besuchen, die sehr krank ist. Und dass man das mit 91 Jahren, ein Jahr vor der eisernen Hochzeit, alles noch ertragen muss, das ist besonders schwer.
Eine ganz harte Zeit. Wir haben vor wenigen Tagen das ja noch anders haben wollen und waren in der Hoffnung, dass wir es anders überstehen, ohne solche drastischen Maßnahmen. Und jetzt sehen wir, wie einigen das Herz bricht.
Nur noch bis zum Abendessen darf Günther Klein bei seiner Frau Ingeborg bleiben.
Du bist traurig, weiß ich. Und wenn du traurig bist, dann bin ich das auch. Also, mach's gut. Und ich hoffe, dass ich dich bald wieder besuchen darf. Wir schaffen das, Mami.
I'm not crying or anything, you're crying. But that's precisely the point. This clip is meant to induce empathy. The researchers found that those just given the information were less likely to socially distance, but those who also felt empathy after watching that clip were more likely to engage in social distancing. After all, what kind of monster would want to go around coofing near Mr. Klein, or end up getting him sick so he can't visit his wife, or even worse, spreading the coof to her? While social distancing may seem self-centered, it often comes from a place of empathy, as much as it does from personal concern for the self. And as such, people may be truly thinking about the safety of others and not just themselves when they wear masks, since, as I stated, masks don't really protect much against catching the coof, only spreading it. And social distancing, whether or not people are totally cogent of it, is actually a pretty big positive in terms of human decency. Is it even so wrong if emotions like fear motivate that positive change in behavior for public health? That's precisely what Harper et al. 2020 found in relationship to the coof, that while it produced fear, that fear was related to social distancing and better personal hygiene. So is it such a bad thing to be afraid of the big bad coof? Probably only so long as that fear is irrational. And with all of that in mind, let's come to some conclusions. Over the course of this video, we've seen how health campaigns can be more harmful than helpful, and how stigma can make public health concerns worse rather than better. We've seen how fear and reactance can cause setbacks for healthcare workers and governments due to the natural human innate nature and desire to not be told what we can and can't do, even often to our own peril. As a species, we value our independence, often to an unhealthy degree and to our own detriment, and it may be possible that in some ways even isolation may have its own detriments, as Kamikubo and Takahashi found that Japan and parts of Europe had some immunity to newer strains of the Coof, labeled G-type based on exposure to an ancestral virus, S-type, and a weaker K-type that provided those regions with a degree of herd immunity that was not present in the US, particularly in the more densely populated states, or states without exposure to previous strains, and building local immunity, leaving states like West Virginia pretty much safe. What that all means is that exposure to an ancestor virus may help protect against the newer strains of the virus. At the same time, while some people will self-isolate, others will become emboldened in maintaining their previous behaviors, throwing caution to the wind and hoarding supplies, or going out in public without taking proper precautions. When our own mortality is salient, we can act in irrational ways, and particularly so when it concerns a novel problem that we don't have any prior experience with. So, even when we've seen similar scenarios in the past, our future behavior is not always rational. Yet despite all of the sort of antisocial behaviors that these circumstances can often elicit, they can also increase our capacity for empathy, our desire to help the less fortunate, and generally make the world a better place. But what do you guys think? Have you experienced psychological reactance in regard to health messages, ignoring them just because they come off as preachy or authoritarian? Have you ever felt stigmatized for having a disease or condition, or fear stigma might be associated with you if you go out in public? What about the current Coof? Have the lockdowns affected you psychologically? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. As always, I love to hear what you guys have to say, and moreover, thank you guys for sticking it out with me even through my long absence. I hope I can get back to making regular content for you guys from here on out. Also, a big shout out to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in my description if you're interested, and also check out the links down below if you want to buy some merch for me. You guys have been great, and as always, all ton of volt.
Feels like I'm falling.